What was the first thing that got you into Warhammer? Long before the advent of Age of Sigmar, the Old World was the fantasy setting by default for Warhammer. And like many of you watching this video, I found out about this magnificent place by reading the pages of a White Dwarf. Although I knew a little bit about the setting because of HeroQuest, it was on December 1993 when I got my first magazine from Games Workshop that I could learn about a world full of strife, magic and heroes. And then I learned about these guys. And it is about the latter, the heroes, that we can have a few disagreements here and there. But you will have to agree with me that Gotrek and Felix not only are amidst the most well-known characters in the franchise, but probably amongst the most beloved ones too. A human poet turned revolutionary and a mysterious dwarf slayer, where quite often everything that stood in the way of the evils of the old world and the peoples that inhabited it. These fan-made miniatures popped up in my Facebook feed this last summer and I couldn't pass the opportunity of painting them. An almost perfect rendition of the Mark Gibbons illustration, the 3D printed miniatures came in 3 different pieces that you just needed a little bit of super glue to assemble. This is not the first time that I paint a copy of Gotrek and Felix. Before these ones, I painted the classic models, but I wanted to do something different, and instead of using washes, I wanted to go back to the roots of how I learned to paint. That will prove to be a difficult decision because of, well, you will see right now. Of all the things that you can bash Games Workshop on, probably the paint pot design is one of the most obvious. Look, I'm not the biggest fan of eyedropper bottles out there, but seeing that the Vallejo paints that I had in my collection hadn't dried after 6 to 7 years of not using them, well, the argument falls moot immediately. Games Workshop might have very good paints, but the bottle designs are very bad, and that's undeniable. And of all the bad designs that Games Workshop has come up during the years, this is probably the worst by far. Very funnily, some of the oldest paints that I had were the ones that were best kept inside the bottles, but I lost many others that I couldn't fix at all. One thing I tried to store them all those years ago was sellotaping the lids in order to not get any air and to prevent them from drying, but it didn't help at all. I threw away all the pots that couldn't be safe, cleaned the lids of dry paint from those that still were somewhat salvageable, and I had this left over to paint Gotrek and Felix. And after priming our heroes in black, I started to do the layering. Layering, as you probably know already, is using lighter and lighter coats of paint, building the colors from darkest to lightest. I started by focusing on 2 of the key elements of the miniatures: Felix's red Sutherland wool cape and Gotrek's fiery orange crest and beard. To achieve the desired results, I will have to do 2 thin coats because of the quality of the pigment of these old paints. Unlike many of the other heroes that we have in the Warhammer Fantasy setting, Felix and Gotrek offer us a more mundane, more first-person perspective to the world they inhabit. They are not people become gods like Sigmar or Nagash. They are not huge representatives or noblemen or monarchs of the societies that they are from. They are as meat and potatoes as you can get to people in the world they inhabit. Gotrek, who heads on into conflict, is quite different from Felix. I find Felix quite relatable, somebody that is not adamant in getting in trouble. He wants to survive, he wants to thrive, and he wants to find sense in this world. But the beauty of the relationship between the 2 of them is that Felix actually is willing to put his life in risk because he has made a promise and he believes on it. And this takes them on all kinds of crazy adventures. Painting by layering is a classic method of doing things, but is also a very time-consuming one. To improve your chances of success, you have to choose your paints correctly, or mix them if you don't have a very good color to transition between them. And feathering and wet blending are going to help those transitions look very smooth. One of the things that I want to learn to do better is painting flesh. In fact, to make it look natural and not waxy, it is a very difficult process that I have not yet mastered. If you have a good recipe that I could use, please leave it in the comments below and I'll make sure that I try it in some of the miniatures that I have to paint. I tried something different here, starting from a reddish base, followed by layering with bronze flesh by Vallejo. On painting these two guys, I will go back and forth on the hair and the skin quite a lot. After highlighting again now with Kislev Flesh, I will do a glaze with cardboard crimson in those areas that I wanted to make sure that were a little bit more saturated. And Felix's cape received the same treatment in the recesses. This is ancient lore, but if you know, you know. This is Gotrek on the cover of the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game. This exciting battle scene screams Oldhammer lore from its four corners. It is also a faithful representation of what happens on one of the earliest William King's stories about Gotrek and Felix, the darkness beneath the world. Here the Slayer looks quite different to more modern representations. Speaking of older depictions of Gotrek and Felix, here you can see them as they appear in White Dwarf 125, where we can see also an advanced HeroQuest adaptation of what happened in this adventure. But if you really want to be shocked, how about seeing this depiction of him in White Dwarf 120? I was quite shocked when I saw Gotrek without a beard in this illustration that depicts the events that happened in the short story Geheimnis Nacht. Both the darkness beneath the world and Geheimnis Nacht appear in the first book of a series called Trollslayer. Yeah, well, okay. But how about we get back to painting that orange hair and beard? With the leftover bronze flesh that I had in my palette, I started highlighting both the beard and the crest of Gotrek. This helped me cover the raised areas where the primer was still visible. I then follow it with a quick wash with Cassandra Yellow. Of course, any sane person will stop by now, but I wanted to get more vibrancy and more contrast, so I started giving some highlights in bleach bone, which afterwards I glazed with Fuegan Orange for the crest and beard of Gotrek, and with Ogrin Flesh for the skin. Felix, on the other hand, received a similar treatment. I painted his hair with bleach bone and then washed it with Cassandra Yellow to obtain a very strong yellow color. A couple of touch-ups with bleach bone and that will be it for the hair and the skin of both heroes. Felix and Gotrek don't have too many earthly possessions. And this is quite strange considering that all the adventures that they have lived should have made them rich several times over. Maybe they are too fond of beer and they waste all their money on that. Or maybe there is something more insidious at play. Whatever the reason, Felix only has to his name his red saddle-lined wool cape, a suit of chainmail, and of course, Karagul, the Wyrm Slayer sword. Gotrek, on the other hand, has a little bit more jewelry than Felix does. And this makes sense considering that all dwarves love gold. But his most precious possession, almost to the point of becoming his own persona, is of course Gotrek's axe, which belongs to an era already long forgotten by everybody except the elves and the dwarves. Painting with layering can be done very easily with something that we call triads. I'm going to show you some of the examples that I use for these paint jobs, like for instance starting with blue. Night blue, and I think this is ultramarine blue, but I don't have the name on it anymore. It's been used beyond that. And then we're gonna give it a final highlight of electric blue and maybe even white. The concept is very simple and straightforward. If you have a dark tone, a mid tone and a light tone, then you can achieve layering very effectively and very easily. On the one hand, you're gonna save time because you don't have to mix paints. But on the other hand, obviously, because you have to buy more paint pots, you will spend more money by doing this. This is one of my favorite triads as well. We're gonna start with a dark green, and then we're gonna move on to jade green and foul green. Final white highlights, and well, you'll see. We're gonna start with the darkest one, and then we're gonna move onto this and onto this. I love this combination for painting gems and etc. See? Okay, and I'm gonna use these to paint the handle of Caragul. I'm also gonna paint some of Gotrek's gems with this. This is my go-to method for painting gems. If you want to see a more in-depth description on how to do this, you can check the video on the link above. One last highlight, now the last green, which in our case is foul green, verde malicioso. We're gonna put it in the bottom corner of jewels. As I was painting the last details on the miniatures like the gems and the stripes on both Gotrek's and Felix's pants, I couldn't but start thinking what had made me click the buy button so fast. And it couldn't be only nostalgia. And I knew this from the bottom of my heart, because you have a great combination of factors here. William King's characters were fantastic avatars that any of us could use to explore the old world. And adding to the equation Mark Gibbons' illustration that depicted them in such a beautiful way, of course getting both the lore and the character of the illustration together into one single package will make these instant classics. If there is ever any plans for a Warhammer Fantasy setting TV series, Gotrek and Felix should be #1 on that spot. These are my favorite Warhammer Fantasy characters. All their exploits are world-changing, and they should have definitely received the recognition of being the greatest heroes of their era. But for all the toils and tribulations, they have received very little praise and rewards. And the goals that they had set for themselves are always tantalizingly near but out of reach. For Gotrek's penance, there is no release, as he always defeats all the monsters and enemies that face him. For Felix, after being rejected by his family, and after losing one after another all the women that he had loved, he had to make peace with the idea that the only friend and companion he will ever have was Gotrek himself. What about you? Which ones are your favorite characters either in Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer 40k? And what miniatures can't you stop buying every time that there is a new version of them? I absolutely love Gotrek and Felix, and there are some more miniatures from them that I still want to paint, but that is a story for another video. Thank you for watching, my name is Miguel, this has been Rush the Wash, and I'll catch you guys in another one. Un beso, adios.